who you are you really the full version of yourself? And when you think about you, do you imagine a single self? Or do you imagine many different selves? I'm Roger Evernden. I'm going to be talking about becoming your many selves. I was brought up to be independent, capable, and confident. And when I grew up, I was encouraged to be myself. And for many years, I felt that I was really being myself. But as I grew older, I began to doubt this. I was not quite so sure, quite so certain that I was being myself. We lived in a semi-detached house at the end of a cul-de-sac with a small but adequate living room. Now, I'm a keen photographer, and as a youngster, I used to invite a few friends around to share photos in a slideshow. When I say a few, it was often as many as 20 or more teenage lads, all crammed into that tiny room. My dad would help me shift furniture, and we'd make benches from planks of wood stacked on bricks. And at half-time, Mum would always provide refreshments. As I look back, I remember that Mum and Dad always supported me in everything that I wanted to do. But their support was more about helping me achieve what I wanted to do, and rarely about who I was. I've come to realise that our society, our education systems, and many of our beliefs and sayings conspire to hide this distinction between being and doing. There's a huge emphasis on doing. When we first meet someone, we quite often ask them, "What is it you do for a living?" We don't usually ask, "Who are you?" And success in our world is measured against our achievements, against what we do. At the same time, we're all encouraged to be a single self. As we grow up, we're told, be yourself. In general conversation, we don't talk about our many selves. We don't ask, "How are your many selves today?" And this emphasis means that we tend to focus on one single dominant self. I began to wonder, what happens if we focus on that single dominant self? Does this mean there are other selves that we overlook and ignore? And what happens if there are other selves that we overlook, ignore, or even banish altogether? How can we really be ourselves if we don't take into account every part of our being? So I found this idea of becoming my many selves profoundly liberating. It gave me a new and different way to think about who I was. Understanding who we are is very difficult because who we are is a social or mental construct. It's quite elusive. It's quite hard to define. So this idea of seeing myself as a close-knit community of many selves was very appealing. It gave me a much more effective way to really understand who I was. I started a quest to find my many selves, to give them each a voice. And it was a quest about who I was rather than what I do. Now, I'm not the first person in history to embark on this journey. Understanding who we are is a subject that's dominated philosophy and psychology for millennia. It's a complex landscape of ideas and theories dominated by giants like Carl Jung, Myers-Briggs, and Stephen Fry. But I began to think that psychology tends to focus on the dark side, on understanding our troubled selves and overcoming personality disorders through professional help. And on the other hand, self-help approaches didn't really seem to embrace this notion of multiple selves. So I started to look for something between these two extremes. I think that deep down, we all want to make the most of our lives. We all want to be the best version of ourselves. We all want to achieve something with our lives. But our being is quite complex. All of us are quite complex. And so it's very hard to find that true identity. This notion of many selves, in psychology, there's been a long-standing debate between are we just one self or are we many selves? I think if we were able to embrace this notion of many selves, if we were to get beyond a focus on a single dominant self, then we could probably all do more with our lives. So how do you find these hidden selves? I started looking for some simple and practical ways in which I could find this balance between being and doing. I'm going to talk about 5 techniques that I found really helpful in my quest. Firstly, in different situations and with different people, I take on different mannerisms and different behaviours. In other words, my personality is a response to a situation or event. It's a reaction to the people that I'm with. It changes depending on my mood, my emotions, and my circumstances. So the first tip is being aware of your different behaviours is a really good way to start to see the different selves that you have. For example, I can be quiet, introverted and thoughtful if I'm trying to deal with a complex problem. This is when my sense-making self is in pole position. Or I can be quite animated, passionate and extrovert when I'm talking about a subject that fascinates me. And this is when my creative self is in control. The second tip is to look at personality profiles, the Enneagram, even daily star signs, because they give you clues as to the type of personality that you have. I found that all of these gave me really useful stereotypes to think about who I was, but none of them seemed to be a very close character match. I didn't want to be typecast as one type of person. That seemed to reinforce this notion of being a single self. And so I cheated. I started to pick out the phrases and words that I felt described me. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to do that. And then I grouped these into different selves. So I separated my upbeat self from my moody self. The third learning was to make a really clear distinction between being and doing. There are many things that we do in our lives because we want to, because we enjoy them, in hobbies, in games, and when we're at leisure. And there are many roles and functions we take on in life, family roles and work roles. I started to look for the patterns behind these. I was looking for the persistent traits that were common across all the varied pastimes and all the various roles that I've taken on in life. For example, I tend to prefer collaborative activities over competitive ones, and I started to refer to this as my collaborative self. And I'm not very good at sitting still and being inactive, so I called this my restless self. I felt that this distinction between being and doing was really important. There are times when I've done things in my life that didn't really fulfill me or any of my selves at all, and that's not so good. And there are times when I've done some things which fulfill one or two of my selves, but the best times are when I've been able to engage all of my selves in everything that I do, and that's by far the most satisfying situation. My next tip, number 4, is to name the selves. I found that giving a name to the selves made it much easier for me to remember them and to imagine them. I ended up with a small group of selves that really described my core being. My sense-making self is fascinated by understanding complexity. It's actually been there throughout my varied work roles as a history teacher, a computer programmer, and an enterprise architect. My teaching self relishes the opportunity to share experiences and to learn. And that self has been there when I write or when I mentor students. And my creative self is there when I make photographs or compose music. But it's not all been good news. As I got to know me better, I realized that there were a number of false selves. They're the fake or pretend persona that I've adopted to protect myself, perhaps in response to a traumatic situation or event, like a fear of flying or a disgust at eating rice pudding. The distinction I would make here is that those false selves are not really me. So in my quest to become my many selves, it's partly uncovering your true soul and spirit, but then at the same time overcoming these false selves. And my fifth and final revelation is that you need to put yourself in situations where you can enable and nurture those many selves. If you can find the situations that really fulfill who you are, then that's a whole lot better than being in situations that don't. There are many other ways in which you can learn about yourselves. You can look at your gifts and talents. You can think about what excites and fascinates you. You can talk with friends and family. The key thing is to really understand your whole being, to embrace your own diversity. Before I embarked on this quest, I hadn't really appreciated how much diversity we all have within us. My focus is no longer on one single dominant self. My hidden selves are no longer overlooked and forgotten. Internally, I feel more empowered. I feel more self-confident. I feel more whole. I feel as though I have a much better balance between who I am and what I do, between the being and the doing. And externally, in relationship with others, I feel unique and special. I feel valued and validated. Becoming my many selves has given me the courage to step beyond the mundane, to achieve the things that really matter in my life. There's this huge emphasis on doing in our lives. And I really do believe that if we all understood the many aspects of our being, all of the different selves within us, then we would be able to do more in our lives. Focusing on that one dominant self limits that potential. It narrows your scope. Becoming my many selves has allowed me to actively seek opportunities to really engage myself in everything I do. Becoming your true selves might give you the courage to step beyond the mundane, to embrace your own diversity, to achieve your potential, and to achieve the most in your lives. Thank you.